So shall we start?
Yes, let me just go ahead and thank you again, Ari, for coming today, and thank you everybody for coming to this talk. I'm super excited about it, and I'm grateful also for Ken organizing this event. It was his outreach that allowed us to have Ari's visit today. I won't do the formal introduction for Ari. I'll leave that up to Ken to do, but I do want to say that I'm the chair of the Center for Health Humanities and also a professor of philosophy at MCPHS. We had just started a new major in health humanities at MCPHS. Is a Bachelor's of Art degree. It is the first ever standalone health humanities major in all of New England. So I'm super excited about it. We already started to have a number of majors in our program. If you are interested in the program, or if you know of people who might be interested in the program, please reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to talk about it and point them to the right direction. Hopefully have you be a part of our cohort. So with that said, I'm gonna hand the baton over to Ken so that he can do the proper introduction. Thanks, Ken.
All right, great. Thank you so much. This is just fantastic. I stopped the share so I can look at my notes, because I could just go on and on. I'm so excited about this event, but I want to give some welcomes, talk about how we're going to handle the session, and then introduce Ari Naiman. So I want to welcome those many of you who are learning about neurodiversity for really the first time. And I also want to welcome those who are with us who engage very regularly with neurodiversity in their academic writing and research and advising government agencies. We have people who are engaged in community organizing and training, even performing on stage. And so many of us who are just engaging with these issues in order to do our best to respect and love the people we care about, and sometimes including ourselves. I want to welcome, we had registrations from the two previous health humanities speakers, both from Europe. I want to welcome those who are joining us from west of Boston. We have people from California, Michigan, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, Alberta, and those several of you from England, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Denmark. And that's a group who are very dear to me because of who they are, and also because they've contributed in very important ways to my own understanding of autism and just what it is to be in the world. So thank you so much for everybody being here. It's just a really important group. Here's how we're going to progress. We're going to have the chat will be open. You can send questions to me at any time. It won't bother anybody else. It's not going to pop up. And that'll help us streamline things. It also means that if you don't exactly know how to ask your question, that's okay, because it'll come to me and I will try to formulate it in an appropriate way. I'll try to be accurate about it, but you don't need to be shy and think, oh, I don't know if this is quite right. It's okay to send it to me. And it also means that you don't have to remember your question for very long. You can type it into the chat and send it off, and I'll have a record of it. And you can do that at any time during the session. Our usual practice is to start with questions from our MCPHS students. And for those of you who don't know, MCPHS stands for Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. Some of you are joining us who may have no previous connection with the university. Okay, so now it's time to talk about Ari Naiman. For many of us, Ari Naiman doesn't need any introduction. We've read about him in Neurotribes, and we're not surprised to see him listed in this book, Sue Fletcher-Watson's revision of Hape's Autism book, as one of the key proponents of neurodiversity. And we know about the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network that Ari founded, and we know that he has served on boards and advisory committees at the state and federal level. What I didn't know until recently is that he did all of that pretty much before he was 21. That's what really got me in preparing for this session. Amazing stuff. He continues in his advanced age, to have wonderful contributions and just really important stuff. Some of those have appeared recently in the New York Times, and I've especially appreciated reading those myself. And he's working on this on a paper on this particular topic, which is important to the everyday lives of a lot of people. And so I'm going to hand it over to him, and I look forward, like everybody else, to hearing what he has to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Are my slides coming up?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that great introduction, Ken, and thank you to MCPHS for hosting what I hope will be a very interesting conversation. So first, just a little bit about me. You know, as Ken mentioned, I was the co-founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and ran the organization from 2006 to 2016. I'm not quite as young as I once was, 32 now, so I'm no longer knee-high to a grasshopper. I served as one of President Obama's appointees to the National Council on Disability. I'm currently a doctoral student in health policy at Harvard, do research on disability policy, long-term services and supports, and bioethics. And, you know, I really see this conversation as reflecting an interesting opportunity to integrate the values of a social movement, the neurodiversity movement, with the concrete questions of measurement and clinical practice that come up in the context of autism service provision, and really, in many ways, in disability service provision as a whole, in that many of the ideas of the neurodiversity movement have found interest outside of autism as well. So I want to begin, as so many presentations do, with a quote. Civil rights practice is fundamentally about who has to change. This quote comes from Professor Kenji Yoshino, who has written an absolutely fantastic book about the concept of covering. Covering, very much related to the concept of passing. Passing is hiding, an aspect of hiding marginalized identity. When someone who is gay pretends to be straight, they are passing for straight. When someone who is Jewish pretends to be a Gentile, they, you know, are passing for Christian or whatever non-Jewish religion is in the majority of in any given culture. When someone who is disabled pretends to be non-disabled, they are passing as non-disabled. Covering is a very related concept. It refers to not hiding the existence of marginalized identity, but instead hiding any overt characteristic of it. So a covering demand, which is something we see very often in society, would be to say, we accept the idea that you can be Jewish and be in our workplace, but if you're wearing a yarmulke or if you're taking off Saturdays, that might be a problem. We accept the idea that you can be gay and be a part of our social group, but if you invite your same-sex spouse to a social gathering or company party, or are too obviously gay, then that represents a problem. And covering is passing and covering are both very relevant concepts when we talk about the neurodiversity movement, because neurodiversity really originated as a response from autistic people to passing and covering demands, both from the larger society and specifically from the world of autism service provision. Autism has existed really in, I think, growing opinion of many researchers, and certainly my own, you know, going back indefinitely, but the diagnosis was documented first in the 1940s and began to be popularized in the 1970s and 80s. And by the early 90s, you began to see the emergence of really the first community of autistic adults who understood themselves to be autistic and began to seek each other out and really form a sense of collective identity and start to discuss their opinions about where autism policy, service provision, and research, and all kinds of other things going on in our name were going. And there was a great deal of concern at that time in this emergent autistic adult community coming together really on the sidelines of autism parent conferences and on this newfangled thing called the internet, that autism research, policy, advocacy, service provision, and so on was something that was happening about us, without us. Jim Sinclair, who is generally considered the founder of the neurodiversity movement, wrote an iconic essay called "Don't Mourn for Us," that really laid out the idea of rejecting this concept of autism as a tragedy and pushing back against this narrative that the objective of autism service provision and research should be to try and cure autistic people by making us look as normal or as non-autistic as possible. Sinclair founded an organization called Autism Network International, ANI, which proved tremendously influential in laying the foundation for what are many autistic-run organizations today, including ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, and many, many others throughout the world. One of the most exciting things that I think we've seen over the last decade is neurodiversity and autistic advocacy proliferate around the world. It was always an international movement, but it's become even more so in very impressive, sophisticated ways in recent years. And the focus of the neurodiversity movement was to try and articulate the views of autistic people with respect to autism, policy, research, and service provision, and in particular to critique some of the ways in which the larger, more prominent parent and researcher dominated organizations were approaching autism, service provision, research, and advocacy. There are a lot of different components of this. Some of this related to representations of autism in the media. Some of this related to conversations around different modes of service provisions. A lot of discussion around pushing back against the emphasis on institutionalization and so on. But I want to focus in particular on the neurodiversity movement's critique of autism interventions designed to make autistic people look and act more normal. One of the most common of those interventions, especially today, is applied behavioral analysis. Applied behavioral analysis is an intervention that is often considered synonymous with autism in a lot of clinical circles in the United States. There's been a very heavy emphasis over the last 20 years or so to secure insurance coverage for ABA for autism. There's been a very heavy emphasis to press providers to refer autistic children and sometimes autistic adults to receive ABA. And there are a great deal of concerns that the neurodiversity movement has. There's a great deal of concern the neurodiversity movement has with regards to ABA. There are really two broad critiques of ABA. The first is that ABA has historically made use of aversive interventions, the use of pain and noxious stimuli in order to modify behavior. I would say proponents of ABA would say that's no longer the case. I think we have some evidence that that's not in fact true, which I'll discuss briefly later, but I don't want to get into too much because it's not the main focus of my argument. The second critique is that the emphasis of ABA is to try and make autistic children, in the words of Ivar Lovaas, the founder of applied behavioral analysis in the context of autism, the most prolific or prominent practitioner, indistinguishable from peers. ABA service provision is very focused on the idea that the goal of autism intervention should be to reduce autistic traits and promote behaviors that are consistent with typical appearance. Here we have the website from one prominent ABA provider that represents the families that, in fact, ABA can recover their autistic children and make them non-autistic. And this is a claim that some ABA providers make, some ABA providers do not make, but regardless, it's really embedded in the underlying goals of applied behavioral analysis, the reduction of autistic traits and the promotion of non-autistic appearance. And if we were to scroll down on this website, we would see exactly what ABA providers mean when they talk about the idea of recovery. First, that individuals have test scores that are in the average range or higher on tests of intelligence, language, socialization, and daily living skills. And, you know, we could quibble about what some of those tests of socialization say, but this is not the most objectionable component. I think we generally do see language acquisition and cognitive development and daily living skill development as positive things. That person is earning passing grades in a regular education classroom with no specialized supports whatsoever. And you know, certainly we want to see autistic children in a regular education classroom. Very big believer in inclusive education. I think there are some interesting and, you know, important questions to ask about whether or not we should, in fact, be prioritizing the idea that our definition of success is that a child or adult receive no specialized supports whatsoever. You know, in fact, someone can be perfectly successful in a general education classroom or in life, you know, with the receipt of some form of specialized supports or accommodations. So I think there is something to be said for that bullet being a little concerning. But the most concerning component of this idea of recovery is the idea that individuals should lose their autism diagnosis, that we should be working to make autistic children and adults look non-autistic such that they no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for autism. And, you know, we can sort of see how that plays out in a wide variety of different places. Many autistic people have expressed frustration with the tendency on the part of many providers to suppress stimming behavior like hand flapping or rocking back and forth and other things that autistic people do because they are personally beneficial, because we like doing them, because they may help us manage anxiety. There's also a concerning emphasis on eye contact as a goal in and of itself. This is an article from, and it looks like the headline is a little cut up there, but it says, BYU students make glasses to help autistic kids' eye contact. And it talks about a technology project at the Brigham Young University designed to try and encourage eye contact by projecting images of things that autistic people are interested in on glasses in locations that autistic people are supposed to look at. And the provider working on this project argues that eye contact is necessary, that it's necessary to build this device to superimpose an image of Mickey Mouse on a child's mother's face, not just because the mother wants her child to look at her in a particular way, which we might argue is or isn't a legitimate goal of service provision. But the provider argues that eye contact is necessary for autistic people to develop joint attention and to have the ability to communicate socially. And so you basically have a model of thinking about autism and autistic challenges that's very straightforward, very linear. It says autistic children don't make eye contact. As a result of that lack of making eye contact, they have social communication challenges. By making autistic children make eye contact, we can address their social communication challenges. And part of the problem with that mode of thinking is that we actually have a fair amount of research that shows that autistic people can display joint attention and can communicate socially. And of course, autistic people ourselves, we would tell you this, and we have for years, via means other than eye contact. And that in fact, autistic people pick up on directional cues from eye gaze, even when not making eye contact. And of course, crucially, eye contact is unpleasant for many autistic people. Many of us don't like to do it. And so this very heavy emphasis in service provision on promoting something that is essentially, we would argue, cosmetic, that is unpleasant for autistic people at any age, and that is unnecessary because autistic people can accomplish the same end of joint attention and social communication via different means other than eye contact. All of this taken together suggests that the demand for eye contact in autism service provision is a passing demand. I'm going to use the phrase passing demand here to encompass both passing and covering demands for simplicity's sake. But basically, what we are seeing in the emphasis on eye contact is a clinical goal whose purpose is to try and make autistic persons look and act normal, to pass as non-autistic. Passing, as I mentioned earlier, is the management of undisclosed, discrediting information about the self. Irving Goffman's seminal book on stigma goes into this, and covering in considerable detail. Again, I'm going to use the word passing here to refer to both passing and covering, really any demand that in our instance, autistic people, but really people from any marginalized group, suppress a trait because it is associated with a marginalized identity. Audre Lorde, the poet, puts this somewhat more eloquently. Am I to be cursed forever with becoming someone else on my way to myself? And this really captures something that we also see in the clinical literature, namely that passing efforts harm autistic people. Camouflaging, which is a word that we see used in the clinical literature, really corresponds to what we would consider as passing or covering, is a risk marker for suicidality in autistic adults. Camouflaging is also associated with poor mental health, burnout, depression, functional challenges, exhaustion, and self-esteem problems. And again, going back to the 1990s, before we had much of this literature, autistic people, through the neurodiversity movement, were very clearly communicating that passing and that clinical demands to pass were burdensome and harmful for autistic people. It's a great resource on this topic for first-person perspectives. Amanda Vivian, who's a fantastic autistic writer, produced in 2011 a resource called the Autistic Passing Project. The web address for it is bottom of the page right there. And it includes a number of quotes from autistic people talking about their experiences with passing. It made me angry and sad and frustrated because I never stopped being autistic. I just learned how to get around in an NT world better. These days, I am pretending to be normal for them, not myself, and that's what hurts. I am actually at a point now where I rarely leave the house because I don't have the energy to pass. These are quotes from the Autistic Passing Project. I encourage you to take a look at it. I think it really illustrates the human stakes in a way that complements the literature and that helps reinforce the underlying critique at the heart of the neurodiversity movement, namely that the goal of autism intervention, service provision, research, etc., should not be to make autistic people look or act normal, but should be instead to improve autistic people's lives consistent with our own desires and preferences. Now, this is the case for the neurodiversity movement. Now, we've also seen some very strong backlash to neurodiversity over the years. Here's an article that ran recently, and well, not so recently, a few years ago, but there are plenty others like it, in Aeon magazine called Against Neurodiversity, arguing that the neurodiversity movement favors the quote unquote high functioning, which, by the way, is a term with no clinical definition, but it's one that we see thrown around a lot, along with the term low functioning in discourse around autism, and overlooks those who struggle with severe autism. And this critique of the neurodiversity movement, very, very common in autism politics, argues that neurodiversity harms individuals with severe impairments, harms autistic people with severe impairments, because there are many people who have autistic traits that are harmful to them, that they do struggle with, and that they do, in fact, want to see, or often that their family members want to see addressed, suppressed, mitigated, or ameliorated, whatever terminology you want to use. And there's been a lot of back and forth over this critique, which has existed really as long as the neurodiversity movement has existed. It often comes from some of the more traditional parent and professional organizations of the neurodiversity movement, which is historically been run by autistic people ourselves, emerged in response to. I don't think it's actually accurate to say that it's parents versus autistic people divide, because you actually do see a large number of families on the side of the neurodiversity movement. I think parents are not a monolith, but there is certainly a dedicated group of some parents who reject the neurodiversity movement because they believe that it doesn't account for the needs of autistic people with severe impairments. Some researchers and a few autistic people have argued that the way to address this is to split autism and really think about it in two distinct groups. This is an article from Simon Baron-Cohen, very prominent, famous autism researcher, arguing that in order to resolve the controversy surrounding neurodiversity, all we need to do is just acknowledge that autism is a diagnosis that contains a lot of very significant differences between different autistic people. And once we acknowledge the heterogeneity of autism, we won't have a controversy over neurodiversity anymore, because we'll have one group of autistic people who will consider the neurodiversity approach relevant to, and we'll apply neurodiversity model to, and we'll have another group of autistic people who will consider the traditional medical model relevant for, and we'll apply it over there. And we'll just separate out the autism diagnosis between those who we apply neurodiversity to and those who we apply the medical cure model to. And this is an idea that is superficially very compelling. A lot of people like this. It seems to offer a way to resolve a very acrimonious conflict. There are a couple problems with it, though. The first is there is no clear dividing line in autism. In fact, the DSM-5 moved away from the 3 distinct autism diagnoses to a single unified autism diagnosis, because they recognized that at different points in a person's life, they might receive all of these diagnoses and that they were applied wildly unevenly. And we actually, with very rare exceptions relating to the small, tiny, minuscule percentage of instances of autism where we have a clear genetic etiology, we don't really have any clear understanding of the different phenotypes within the autism diagnosis. In addition, although neurodiversity advocates are painted by their opponents as representing only the quote unquote high functioning, and I will say I don't love the term high functioning because it has no definition and because it has its roots in the high grade, low grade terminology of institutionalization. But because that is, despite the fact that neurodiversity advocates are painted as universally representing those with less severe impairments, there are, in fact, many autistic people and many family members of autistic people with more severe impairments that support the neurodiversity movement. And then finally, crucially, the neurodiversity perspective argues that the emphasis on indistinguishability from peers, that the emphasis on typical appearance harms autistic people, even if you are not able to talk, even if you also have a co-occurring intellectual disability. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that point of view is actually consistent with seeking service provision, support, and even amelioration of impairments and intrinsically harmful characteristics. But the approach of, again, segmenting out autism is one that neurodiversity activists reject as the compromise to resolve the divides in the autism world. So I'm gonna skip forward a little bit just in order to maintain time. But the traditional approach, as we talked about earlier, is to equate autistic traits with autistic challenges. And the way this thinking goes, more or less, is autistic people display unusual traits, such as repetitive behavior and lack of eye contact. Autistic people also experience challenges like social communication difficulties and self-injurious behavior. Non-autistic people don't display these traits or experience these challenges. Therefore, the way to mitigate these challenges is to suppress autistic traits and promote non-autistic ones. And part of the concern with this logic is it seems to place the form of certain behaviors over their function. Neurodiversity argues that there are unusual autistic traits and there are autistic challenges, and they're both caused by autism, but one does not necessarily cause the other. That suppressing stimming behavior or promoting eye contact does not actually correspond to improving social communication skills, because social communication challenges are not caused by lack of eye contact, but they're caused by the underlying neurological differences that represent the disability of autism, which may also cause eye contact, but you can't form a direct causal relationship from the fact that someone doesn't make eye contact to the fact that they have social communication challenges. Autistic people may find that there are other ways to address social communication challenges other than making eye contact that are more effective for us because autistic people are in a meaningful way different than non-autistic people. So endeavoring to imitate non-autistic behavior may not lead to the same results that it would if that same behavior was applied in a non-autistic person. And we've tried to operationalize this a number of different ways. I'm going to show you some screenshots from the DSM-5 autism criteria. I had the pleasure of advising the DSM-5 neurodevelopmental disorder task force. I worked with Dr. Stephen Kapp and a number of other folks at ASAN to produce advice. There are a number of things that were incorporated based on our feedback. One was the new DSM-5 criteria for autism. I shouldn't say new, they're 7 years old now, but the DSM-5 criteria for autism acknowledges that autistic people, because of passing demands from clinicians or from the larger society, may be camouflaging or masking autistic traits, but that they are still autistic and that they shouldn't lose their diagnosis by virtue of learned behavior that lets them look non-autistic. We also were very concerned by early proposals to add a severity scale to the autism diagnosis. And early versions of the severity scale included, as instances of greater severity, individuals who had excessively focused or fixated interests. And we worked with the DSM-5 committee to, in fact, change the severity scale. And these are the two instances, what's present within it currently, to instead focus on the level of support someone requires and to really be oriented towards things that autistic people might find personally distressing rather than autistic traits that many of us would find pleasurable, like our focused interests, or even neutral, you know, like stimming or rocking. We generally do not want to see a severity scale which has the sizable possibility of being used as a proxy for treatment outcomes, be defined in such a way that tells providers that they should seek to reduce pleasurable or neutral autistic traits. Instead, we want it organized, if we have to have a severity scale at all, which I think some of us question, we want it organized around need for support and areas of difficulty where autistic people and the neurodiversity critique does accept the need for some service provision and intervention. And if you want to read more about our work with the DSM-5 committee, there's a fantastic book chapter Stephen and I wrote about this, available in a new anthology called Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement. Now, what if we want to go beyond the diagnostic criteria for autism? Because, you know, in general, service providers rely on many tools other than the diagnostic criteria to decide how they're going to deliver services. There's the old saying, "In God we trust, others must provide data." That saying has, in some positive and in some very negative ways, really dominated in the autism world. There's been a very heavy emphasis on data collection. That presents both a challenge and an opportunity for neurodiversity advocates, in that we can look at some of the measures, the outcome measures being used to evaluate autism interventions, and really deconstruct which components of them do or don't align with the principles of the neurodiversity movement. And I'm going to show you some examples here that really get into some of the nitty-gritty of, however, how we can begin to define what neurodiversity might mean for service provision and research, both contexts in which these clinical instruments are frequently utilized. This is the social reciprocity scale. This is an example of a few items from the social reciprocity scale. And one of the things you see very clearly here is the social reciprocity scale, which is very frequently utilized in both clinical trials, a wide variety of research studies, and in some clinical practice in autism, includes a number of items in assessing social reciprocity that from the neurodiversity perspective, we might find somewhat concerning. For example, item 16, does a child, and this is the children's version of the social reciprocity scale, avoid eye contact or have unusual eye contact? If someone does, then they receive a score of greater severity. And one of the things that the SRS is used for in clinical trials is in evaluating whether an intervention results in a reduction of severity or an increase in social reciprocity. And from that standpoint, it becomes very concerning if you have items within the SRS, within the tool used to measure social reciprocity, that assumes that the only way by which autistic people can express social reciprocity and can be successful in social communication is through the same ways as non-autistic people. And so the fact that the SRS, and there are other examples throughout the SRS, embeds essentially a passing demand into how it evaluates progress in autism interventions becomes very concerning. Again, looking at whether or not someone is avoiding eye contact is a perfectly legitimate thing to do if you're trying to diagnose autism. It's true, autistic people do avoid eye contact. That is characteristic of autism. It's a much more problematic thing to do if what you're trying to do is evaluate whether or not an intervention is working, and working in the sense of delivering additional value to people's lives, because it defines success as the reduction of autistic traits. Of course, not all items within the SRS2 have these problems. So see difficulty in making friends. I think we can all agree that improving the ability to make friends and improving social relationships that people have access to is a goal that we can all get behind. There's no critique there. But again, you do see, and here we have the young adult version of the SRS, a number of items that are concerning from the neurodiversity perspective. I have repetitive behaviors that others consider odd. It's really, I think, very questionable ethically if it is the appropriate province of service providers to define success as reducing behaviors that others consider odd just because they are associated with and characteristic of autism. Similarly, monotone voice and efforts to modify autistic prosody and so on. These are traits that may be socially stigmatized, but they are not in any sense intrinsically harmful. This is the SciBox ASD. The SciBox itself is a measure of obsessive compulsive behavior designed for OCD. The SciBox ASD, and I should have noted at the bottom, was developed by Lawrence Scahill and his research group, was kind enough to provide me with a copy. The SciBox ASD is an adaptation of the SciBox, specifically designed for use with autistic people. And it's been utilized in clinical trials. A few colleagues of mine and I actually had a letter earlier this year in the Journal of American Medicine critiquing a recent drug trial for relying on the CyBox-ASD as its primary outcome measure, because the CyBox-ASD, like the previous example I provided, although to an even greater extent, defines success as the reduction in autistic traits. And again, you can see here, there are a lot of instances where when we actually look at the items, we find that the traits in question are not in any sense harmful. You know, there are some instances, repetitive self-injurious behavior, repetitive sexual behavior, that you know, you can make a pretty strong argument that these may be appropriate targets for intervention. But informing providers and families that they should define success by reducing echolalia, reducing the need to repeat routine activities, hand or arm flapping, repetitive play with certain objects, trucks, trains, dinosaurs. These may be appropriate diagnostic things to look for. They are not appropriate in any sense of the term, you know, for targeting for intervention. And if you look at how this plays out in the CyBox-ASD, the CyBox-ASD actually scores a child as more severe if they would react with distress if being prevented from performing repetitive behaviors such as repetitive play, hand flapping, arm flapping. Similarly, a child is scored as more severe if they do not try and stop repetitive behavior. And again, these are in part concepts that really come from applying a model that was really developed for use in OCD, and really only modestly adapting it into the very different context of autism. Autistic people generally like our repetitive behaviors. In OCD, repetitive behaviors are distressing to the people who experience them, really not in any sense comparable. Similarly, if behaviors are more peculiar, they are scored as more severe on the CyBox-ASD. And this is, again, not just a matter of, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say political correctness or terminology or social niceties. This has concrete impacts on how we evaluate what forms of service provision, what forms of intervention, what forms of really almost everything we do in autism, whether or not they work. And it provides clear instructions to providers and to families as to what their goals should be. So from the CyBox-ASD and other similar instruments, we really see families and providers receiving the instruction that they should reduce the peculiarity of autistic behaviors, that autistic people should be told to try and resist these behaviors which are not harmful and may be pleasurable and that come naturally to them. And I think it would be very difficult to come up with a more clear instance of a passing or a covering demand than that. And that families and providers should intervene to try and prevent hand flapping, rocking, lack of eye contact, and other perfectly natural things for an autistic person to be doing that really don't harm anyone. And so that has a great deal of relevance. And I believe that when we talk about operationalizing the neurodiversity movement and taking it from something that has shown up quite a bit in you know, social criticism and media criticism, and turning it into something that can have very concrete impacts on the world of autism service provision, research and intervention, which is really what neurodiversity was initially designed to try and influence. We really need to look at these outcome measures and pressure for, and urge their revision in order to try and shift clinical practice. One other thing I'll highlight here, we have seen, I think even some researchers even some traditional autism researchers are recognizing that this is a little problematic, although not necessarily for ethical reasons. We've seen the ADOS-2, which is one of the major diagnostic instruments for autism, utilized as a measure of clinical outcomes. And this really goes back to that concept that we saw on that card page, and it's really embedded within ABA and a lot of other thinking in autism service provision, that the goal of intervention should be to try and make an autistic person look and act as non-autistic as possible, to reduce traits associated with the diagnosis, independent of whether or not they are harmful or distressing to the individual. So really the underlying message here is we have to separate diagnosis and outcome measurement and recognize that some of these tools may be perfectly appropriate in diagnosing autism because they do accurately describe ways in which autistic people are different from non-autistic people, but they are highly inappropriate for defining what the goals of service provision should be, because autistic people will continue to be different from non-autistic people, even after intensive intervention. And that passing demands embedded within clinical practice may result in autistic people that appear typical, but this ignores the considerable personal distress, harm, and effort that is imposed upon autistic people, that autistic people are burdened with as a result of these passing demands that have been that have become pervasive in the culture of autism service provision and intervention. So I want to take a few minutes here before I wrap up. I think I can take another, what do you think, Ken? 10 minutes before I wrap up, and then we'll have time for questions.
That sounds fine. We all want to hear what you have to say, and although some people may have other places to go, my Zoom is pretty much unlimited, so we can hang out until you're exhausted.
I think we'll probably still hit the 2:30 mark, but I'll take another 10 minutes to wrap up.
Sounds good.
A couple of additional things here. Now, I think it is important to acknowledge that there may be some circumstances where instruction in passing might be legitimate. We should maintain a strong presumption against the use of passing demands in clinical practice. But there might be some circumstances where a service provider might legitimately and ethically provide service provision that has the effect of reducing a trait that is associated with autism. But I think we should have a very high bar. I'm going to try and illustrate some of the relevant ethical considerations here with examples outside of the world of autism, because I think in many ways the culture of emphasizing indistinguishability from peers is so intense in the autism world that it can be useful to step outside of it in order to illustrate some of the general principles we may extrapolate back into the world of autism. So here's an instance that I find very concerning. It's a news story from 2012 about a family whose 15-year-old son with Down syndrome has gotten cosmetic surgery to make his ears look more normal. And this is cosmetic surgery. It's very similar to surgery that used to be done, generally considered unethical now, to modify the eyes of people with Down syndrome to make them look more like a more typically appearing. And you know, the frame that's provided here is this person was bullied because of their ears. They received cosmetic surgery and now they're thrilled. And so what's the problem? And I think many of us, again, going back to that Kenji Yoshino quote at the beginning of our presentation, who has to change, would find this to be somewhat concerning. That the idea that we are going to respond to social stigma solely by modifying the individual, and that we are essentially going to accept the legitimacy of that bullying by saying we are going to change a person's appearance in a way that has no no other purpose other than to make them try and pass as normal, is something that should raise real ethical red flags for us. So that's actually helpful in a lot of ways, because it highlights one initial question that we might want to ask, when subjecting any form of instruction or intervention that may have the effect of increasing passing to evaluation. Namely, does it serve any purpose other than promoting passing? Cosmetic surgery really doesn't. Does an intervention serve any purpose other than promoting typical appearance? There are interventions that may make someone look more typical, but actually have other underlying purposes. One example that comes up, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment, is you have many people who may have mobility impairments and may opt to use crutches rather than a wheelchair. And I'll talk a little bit more about the pros and cons that many people with mobility impairments go through in thinking about that. One reason why they might opt to do that is to look or appear more typical. But another reason why they might opt to do that is to have the ability to traverse stairs. And, I think you get into a very interesting discussion there as to if you are a service provider and you're talking to someone about their desire to select a particular mobility aid or their desire to select some other intervention that has both passing and non-passing purposes. Why is someone seeking a particular goal? Is it solely because they want to look as normal as possible? Well, if it's an adult, they have the right to make their own decisions, but you still might want to have a conversation with them. If it's a child, especially if it's a demand being placed on the child by their parents, I don't want you to use a wheelchair, I want you to use a crutch because it looks more normal, then that might be more concerning. Alternatively, if the primary reason someone is seeking an intervention that may have incidental passing effects, but they're primarily being sought for non-passing purposes, that might conceivably be legitimate. That is not necessarily by itself sufficient reason. Not every passing demand with a non-passing purpose is ethical. There might be multiple means of accomplishing the same goal. But I would argue that the existence of a non-passing purpose is an important prerequisite in evaluating whether or not whether or not instruction in passing rather than a passing demand might conceivably be legitimate. I'd also highlight whether or not a trait is personally distressing. In the context of autism, we're usually talking about specific traits. So, if we were to see the neurodiversity movement's critique taken more seriously in clinical practice, one of the things that we would find ourselves doing is going through instruments like the SciBox and the SRS2 and many others, and saying, all right, at least for the purposes of this instrument's use in outcome measurement, we need to pick out those things that are legitimate to incorporate and are legitimate to make goals of service provision, and those things that are not legitimate. And one of the questions we might find is, is somebody distressed by the existence of a trait? But here we come back to this example previously. Someone may be distressed by their atypical appearance for reasons that really have nothing to do with their atypical appearance, but more have to do with how other people in society respond to that appearance. And we usually don't accept it as ethical to enforce essentially cosmetic behavior modification or surgery or any number of other things on children. And often, when they're incorporated as a standardized part of clinical practice rather than a choice an adult makes in a fully informed way, even on adults, solely because of reasons of societal stigma. So, the question of whether or not something is personally distressing is relevant, but it's not sufficient. And I think you get into a really interesting discussion here as to why a trait is personally distressing. And there are different approaches that one might take if one is thinking about teaching someone to engage in situational passing. You're about to go into a job interview. Here are some useful job interview skills. Making eye contact may be one of them if you decide not to disclose that you're autistic, versus ongoing passing demands. And instruments like the SciBox and the SRS-2, which are often utilized in the context of evaluating early intervention, drug trials, and other similar things, really represent ongoing passing demands. The forms of intensive behavioral intervention and other forms of intervention that are associated with these instruments are really designed to be used to create an expectation of behavior modification that is lasting and permanent and gets internalized on the part of the individual. And that really is something we should find, more concerning and apply a very high bar, before deciding we consider it to be acceptable. It's also the question of whether or not a trait causes intrinsic harm. In the objections to the neurodiversity movement, we often see folks refer to self-injurious behavior as an example of, how can you say that we shouldn't be trying to make someone less autistic. My autistic child self-injures. Obviously, we should be dealing with self-injurious behavior. And so the neurodiversity argument is invalid for, that particular child. And I think it is certainly the case that dealing with self-injurious behavior is a legitimate goal of intervention. I think the difficulty here is that, that does not justify the wide variety of other non-intrinsically harmful autistic traits that are subject to interventions. I would say, and there has been some research on the views of neurodiversity proponents, in case you don't believe me, but as someone with a very long history in the movement, I can confirm that neurodiversity proponents have no issue with interventions designed to address self-injurious behavior. Now, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting discussions in item by item analyses of these instruments as to what constitutes intrinsic harm. Often I've seen providers, when presenting these ideas to them, say to me, well, the parents I talk to are very distressed that their child won't make eye contact with them. And I consider that intrinsically harmful. And so in order to respond to the family preference, I'm going to encourage eye contact. Or similarly, the service provider finds it very inconvenient that the child keeps on flapping their hands. So I consider that intrinsically harmful. Or, the atypical appearance sparks bullying, and so that's intrinsically harmful. And I think we should be very skeptical of those arguments, in large part because they ignore the harm that passing demands cause. And so they really think only in terms of one side of the equation. They assume that passing only has benefits, and they give no credence to both the perspectives of autistic adults, but also a growing body of research literature showing that passing demands do in fact cause harm. So, there certainly are going to be a lot of cases in the middle of self-injury and violence that are obviously intrinsically harmful, and lack of eye contact, or stimming and odd prosody that I would argue are just stigmatized and not intrinsically harmful. But, this illustrates the underlying ethical principles at play. And I want to come back to that question of a person with a mobility impairment deciding between a wheelchair and crutches, because it's certainly the case that crutches offer some advantages in terms of navigating the built environment that a wheelchair does not. But also a wheelchair offers many advantages that crutches do not. In fact, many of my friends with mobility disabilities report that the first time they got their power chair and the first time they decided, despite the urging of family members and providers, that they were not going to organize their life to try and retain the ability to walk for as long as possible, but in fact, we're going to begin relying on a wheelchair, that their mobility dramatically increased, that their ability to do things in the world dramatically increased, that the costs associated with even the legitimate non-passing benefits of crutches as opposed to a wheelchair were just not worth the burden associated with crutches and sacrificing the benefits associated with having access to a power chair. So I would finally add, that we really need to evaluate whether or not something represents the least burdensome means of accomplishing that non-passing purpose. We've got a fairly initial framework for evaluating the ethics of passing instruction here. And I just want to close by making two additional points. First is, many people will say, well, a lot of autistic people don't communicate. So it's going to be very difficult to evaluate if somebody finds something distressing or not. And I would push back on that a little bit. Everyone communicates. We just don't always understand all communication. And I think actually, even if you spend some time with some of the families that bring up this concern initially, outside of the highly politicized nature of these arguments, they would agree with you. A non-speaking autistic person generally will find some way of communicating distress or pleasure. It's often their family members that are especially good at evaluating that. So, I think we do need to give some credence to the fact that autistic people have inner lives, even if they aren't always able to communicate that in very sophisticated ways. And, begin to start thinking about how we can, to the greatest extent possible, parse these principles throughout the totality of the autism spectrum, rather than, conceding the point that Baron Cohen and some other people make, that neurodiversity should be something that applies only to those who can talk or only those who don't have an intellectual disability. I think that conceding that point would be a real failure of solidarity on the part of the neurodiversity movement. As I've stated earlier, we should have a strong presumption against passing demands in clinical practice. It should be very, very, very difficult for us to justify any ongoing passing demands in clinical practice. And I think when we think about outcome measures, we really are talking about ongoing passing demands. If something is embedded in an outcome measure like the SciBox or the SRS-2, you don't really have the opportunity in any meaningful way to make an individualized decision. Does it make sense for this person? How do you weigh the costs and benefits for this person? And so on. It really is defined as at a very basic level how we consider progress in autism intervention. And so a very big part of the neurodiversity movement's work in the coming years really should be to make the case that the use of outcome measures like the SciBox, the SRS-2, and a number of others that incorporate passing demands is unethical, and that we should be working to revise these measures in order to make them ethical prior to continuing to allow their use in clinical practice and in research that has the purpose of evaluating interventions as opposed to simply diagnosing or characterizing autism. Many of these measures are totally legitimate for exploring the characteristics of autism. They do a relatively good job characterizing what autism is. They don't do such a good job of characterizing how we should respond to that. As we think about that effort to revise autism outcome measures, we should look to participatory action and community-based participatory research models that involve autistic adults, both those with research backgrounds and those without, as full partners in the process of revision. And the Aspire project, the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership and Research and Education, has been doing some really fantastic work along those lines. They currently have a project regarding evaluating patient-reported outcome measures to align them with, identify those that measure the outcomes that matter most to autistic adults. I think we really need to expand that emphasis on patient-reported outcome measures, where there often is a recognition that autistic people and others who will be doing the reporting need to be in the room to also look at clinician and parent-reported outcome measures, in part because the ethical issues are very relevant there. Even if a measure is going to be utilized by providers, it's going to be utilized on autistic people. And so you really do need autistic people in the room and a meaningful partnership to tackle these ethical questions. And I think this idea of operationalizing the neurodiversity movement, one of the reasons why it's so promising is it opens up a whole universe of additional research that we can and should be doing. First, there's a great deal of ethics work that will need to be done evaluating the ethics of trait-specific passing demands. And I imagine that we will see some of our friends and colleagues who do publish in the ethics research literature, put together some truly excellent articles evaluating the ethics of the demand for eye contact, the demand to suppress stimming, and I'm sure we will see some of the folks out there in the autism service provision world really argue that everything is fine just the way it is, and put forward very intense rebuttals to those arguments, which we may find a little frustrating, but at least we'll be talking about the same things, and at least we will move away from this normative assumption that anything autistic is legitimate to try and suppress, and instead argue that providers must make an affirmative case meeting a relatively high ethical bar prior to trying to modify behavior in support of passing. There's a great deal of clinical work to be done revising outcome measures and revising autism service provision methods. And I think there's also some interesting observational research. I mentioned earlier that the other major critique of ABA is the use of aversives, pain as a means of behavior modification. And often in modern arguments around ABA providers will say, well, we don't really do that anymore. In fact, if you look at the Code of Ethics for BCBAs, Board Certified Behavior Analysts, it does permit punishment and aversive interventions. It states it should be utilized as a last resort, but it does still permit it. There's been some interesting research. Frida Brown at CUNY has done some of the best of it, looking at surveying ABA and PBIS experts regarding their perceptions of treatment acceptability, the acceptability of particular interventions in their fields that find that ABA providers do in fact continue, a significant, substantial minority does in fact continue to view aversive interventions as legitimate. It continues to be a problem in the field. Even some practitioners of very harsh aversive interventions like contingent electric shock, which is rare, continue to be welcome at ABAI, the association's professional conference. So the reason I bring that up, and the discussion about ABA and aversives is really a separate conversation, is it helps us empirically to actually look at what providers are doing. And as we begin to get a sense as to which modes of autism intervention, which priorities of autism intervention, I should say, rather than modes, which priorities in autism intervention we consider illegitimate, we really should be surveying both experts and frontline providers in a wide variety of different modalities to understand whether or not they are still using those particular goals for intervention, because these dialogues and these arguments back and forth, you do this, no, I don't, your field says you do, well, that's not what it means, are just often very frustrating and unproductive. We would really benefit from bringing more of an empirical lens to study not just what autistic people do, but also what service providers do as well. Finally, I'm just going to say that an emphasis on outcome measurement and looking at autism outcome measurement as where the rubber meets the road in the neurodiversity movement's critique of autism intervention, I think has the potential to turn down the temperature in the ideological conflicts in the autism world. I'm not of the belief that we need peace or truce in the quote unquote autism wars, having spent considerable part of my career working to politicize autism and to heighten the contradictions between the different perspectives in the autism world. I actually think that it's better that we are litigating these conflicts and values, and we're getting these problems out in the open. In the olden days where it was really only parent and professional voices that predominated, and autistic people largely had an advisory opinion at best that often was limited to talking about our personal experiences rather than our opinions on values, ethics, research, or any number of other things. We don't want to go back to those days. So the ideological conflicts in autism are going to continue because they reflect real differences in values. But I think once we start to look at item by item evaluations and outcome measurement, we can at the very least begin to mitigate some of the misrepresentations of the neurodiversity movement that are put out to families. And I think many families who are concerned about neurodiversity are misinformed that that the movement wants to make it so that they can't get service provision to address self-injury, or they can't get service provision to promote language or cognitive development. And that's just really not the case. And by the same token, I think family members, by and large, do often find themselves wondering, why on earth is there such an emphasis that my child make eye contact? What's so wrong with the fact that my child flaps their hands, or rocks back and forth? And so I think the more that we can really focus on the concrete implications of neurodiversity, in addition to some of these more hot button debates around modes of intervention and conflicts in public policy, the more that we can better understand each other and I think advance the ideas of the neurodiversity movement to new audiences. All right, I think that brings me to the end of my discussion, or end of my presentation rather, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you all so much.
Well, that is awesome. Thank you, Ari. You can't hear the applause. There's already been a lot of applause in the chat, actually. There's several people have just sent this chat saying, this is brilliant, this is awesome. I'm so glad I'm here. A few people said, I am so upset that I have to leave to pick up my kid from school. Apparently some schools are still open, and things like that. So there's so much going on. I do have, and some of these compliments are from people I don't know, and some of them are from people I know. And I absolutely can tell you should value if they compliment you. It's a big deal and should mean a lot. So I do have some questions, and they're from a variety of different people. That is, people with different perspectives. Some who I know are autistic and have experiences personally, and some who I believe are not, although I don't know. So one of our students asked about ABA. And of course, there are concerns with ABA, and this, I believe, is a student who's read Daniel Wilkenfeld and McCarthy's paper, raising some concerns. I know you're aware of that paper. The student asks, well, can someone still accept ABA therapy even if they know that there are lots of problems with it? Could they benefit? And I think that I might rephrase the question like, well, you know, do we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Is there some way that somebody could say, I want ABA, even though I know that in a lot of forms, you know, it can be harmful, but I could still get some benefit from it?
I think one of the problems is it's generally not people seeking ABA for themselves. They're seeking it for their children. And I think you do see a very different circumstance in terms of, you know, the ethical acceptability of imposing a passing demand on a child, especially a all-pervasive. Remember, this is the ABA providers argue for applying it 30, 40 hours a week on a child from a very young age. You know, do I think it's certainly you know, possible that an adult in a fully informed way, you know, might say, I want to get instruction on how to look more normal. You know, I think it's possible. I think you still need to really have a meaningful conversation about what's motivating that. If it in fact is coming from you know, things in the broader society that might be better addressed through social change than through behavior modification. But that's really very rarely what we're talking about here. Now, you know, part of the challenge that I think we face in these discussions is families are presented with only a very limited range of options. You know, groups like Autism Speaks and others have very aggressively promoted ABA as the only option. And insurers, in response to laws that have been passed mandating ABA, have responded accordingly. And so, you know, families may have ABA presented to them as, you know, their only choice for early intervention. And sometimes families will make very ad hoc decisions, you know, even families that sort of want to see the neurodiversity perspective practiced, about trying to you know, work closely with a specific provider to get them to change the way that they do their work and so on. You know, I'm not going to critique individual choices of individual families, especially when families don't have access to other intervention. But I do think that you're always going to face an uphill battle trying to retrofit a mode of service provision that has this emphasis on indistinguishability from peers really very heavily in its DNA. You know, I think you do see, in part because ABA is so heavily embedded, a lot of folks that say, well, let's change ABA instead. The problem is that when you talk to the ABA providers, you generally find folks who say, well, you know, the problem doesn't exist, you know, or, you know, Usually you will hear from them either doing these things isn't in fact the problem, it's appropriate to suppress autistic traits, it's necessary, or you will hear we are not in fact trying to suppress autistic traits, which are sometimes contradictory responses. So I don't rule out the possibility of reform in ABA, but I think it has to actually start before we begin to take it seriously. I think on balance, I think the emphasis really needs to be on critiquing the intervention, pushing for the availability of alternatives. And if there's a faction in ABA among ABA providers that decides to seriously work on reform, well, we're articulating principles here they can use for that. They don't need our permission to try and fix their broken field. In the meantime, we're not going to validate the legitimacy of the intervention when we believe these severe ethical problems still exist.
Right, fair enough. That's a great answer. That makes a lot of sense. I've got another question here, which I think you may have answered, but this person asks, are there any circumstances where you think it would be a good outcome or an acceptable outcome to reduce repetitive behaviors? And I think your answer was, sure, when they're injurious or when there's intrinsic harm. Is that?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. That's correct. And that's part of why I think it's useful to articulate these broad principles, because you will see, when these things come up, I have a paper undergoing review right now, which I got comments back recently. One of the comments was, what if you have a child who is stimming such that they cannot be examined in the doctor's office? And, as a result, you've got to suppress stimming. Well, maybe. I mean, you might find other adaptive mechanisms to, examine that child, but maybe you've got to momentarily suppress stimming for, a 15-minute doctor appointment. But that doesn't really justify, embedding this as a normative expectation and outcome measurement and as a standard part of early intervention as it is now. So I think it's certainly the case you will have edge cases with, certain kinds of stimming, certain context in stimming, but, we articulate these principles and we talk about the problems in part because at the moment, we believe that in autism intervention, in large segments of autism intervention, the problems outweigh the problems are more common than the edge cases of acceptability.
Fair enough. So again, these are coming from very different perspectives. Some people who've engaged with these issues a lot, others not so much. And I have a very interesting question, which I think I know one part of the answer, but I think I can complicate it a little bit and make it really maybe quite interesting. So the psychologist among us asks whether it makes a difference what the etiology of autistic symptoms are. Now, I'm pretty sure you would say, well, it doesn't matter what story we tell, if we tell it comes from a gene or it comes from epigenetics or whatever. But the particular question focuses on autistic symptoms that might come up from PANDA, the pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infections. The reason I think that that's an interesting question is this. One of the reasons that we might give for not trying to make people not autistic is because they're autistic, and if we make them not autistic, they're not the same person. But if we think about some change coming on someone, right? I mean, obviously, we want to avoid the story that says somebody took my kid away and replaced it with this autistic, fake, right? Which is that kind of story. That's not, but suppose you have somebody, right, who then has some kind of accident or something and now it has changed. I think that's a kind of question that's being asked here. What about an intervention that would kind of put them back, restart them, put them back to having the neurology that they had before? Now, you don't need to say that the autistic traits are bad. You just need to say, well, it's not There just happen not to be the traits that this person came with.
So let's interrogate that a little bit, because I think a couple of points I would make here. First, very much an edge case in terms of autism. Autism is generally not an acquired disability. It's
Right.
it's, you know, the overwhelming research shows that it's you know, almost always present from birth. You know, what we refer to as autism, I would say, is present from birth and is genetic. I think sometimes there are autistic traits that can be referred to as autism that are associated with acquired disabilities, but that's pretty rare. But in terms of, you know, kind of the ethical analysis in those edge cases, I think I would go back to the question of, is there a non-passing purpose involved? And I think usually when you're talking about acquired disability, it's pretty rare that you have an acquired disability that, you know, whose characteristics are, you know, entirely limited to, you know, neutral or pleasurable characteristics. You know, I think usually you're going to see with an acquired disability of that nature something that we would put into the category of intrinsic harm. You know, difficulties with cognitive development, difficulties with communication, you know, that fall into that category. And you know, again, even then, I don't know that it's presumptively legitimate. If you show intrinsic harm, you automatically, you know, find an intervention to be legitimate. You have to still then weigh the costs and benefits, and crucially, the preferences of the individual. But the reason I'm reluctant to just draw a bright line and say, you know, from birth, you know, passing demands bad, acquired, you know, you can get away with them, is that in fact many of these issues apply beyond autism and are very relevant, you know, as I discussed with the mobility impairment example, to some of our friends in the acquired disability world too. So I think in autism context, that's not a super relevant question because it's the idea of acquired autism. Usually we wouldn't refer to something like that as autism. We might refer to it as autistic-like traits, but you may disagree as to whether or not that's a difference that may not matter. But regardless, you know, part of the reason why I tried to, in articulating that ethical framework, apply it more broadly than autism is because I do think that the underlying analysis would be relevant even if it was an acquired condition.
Okay, that's also that's as usual a very smart answer. Here's a question from someone who has thought about this a lot. I happen to know. And asks about whether helping autistic individuals prepare situational scripts is objectionable. Reading the question, can it be considered an active promotion of passing? To me, this person writes, stimulating the creation of situational scripts focuses on providing predictability for the autistic person and thereby decreases discomfort. But on the other hand, the situational script can be like crutches for passing. So what's your response?
I think it really depends on the circumstance, the individual, and the you know, the nature of the script and how it's being applied. You know, I realize it depends is sort of the worst possible answer to give when having ethical debates. But you know, some relevant considerations I would put out there. I think situational passing is often appropriate when it's a choice of the individual. You know, the example I provided earlier of a job interview is a good one. I think you often have to consider the degree to which individuals have the autonomy in a situation to make that choice in a free way. And, you know, that's obviously more the case the older they get, the less power people have over them, you know, the more they have the opportunity to exit a situation. Those are all considerations that, you know, come up in the context of educational environments that have to be weighed very carefully. I think it's also important to try and distinguish in the process of instruction between passing demands and situational or contextual passing instruction, by which I mean often because these ideas are embedded in outcome measurement, they're part of the definition of success in many forms of early intervention. You know, you do not see children taught, well, you know, you might want to make eye contact, you know, and if you, or you might not, but if you don't, here's what people will think. If you do, you know, I mean, if you do, you know, here's what people will think, and, you know, here's some things you might want to explain, and so on. And you get into an interesting discussion of how much nuance you can or can't communicate, you know, to a 3-year-old there, and so on. But that's rarely done. I mean, usually what you will see is this very intensive effort around saying, this is the way to behave. We will reward you if you behave this way. We will not reward you, or in some ways punish you, you know, if you do not. So, I mean, I think if you are trying to teach, especially older children, situational passing skills, it can be very important to do it in a way that affirms their autonomy to use them or not, and to be very cognizant of the power you may have over them in that situation, and really reinforce their ability to make that choice.
Right. I think that the power and the power both with respect to parents and autistic individuals, you know, and providers, the power relations are really quite significant. I've got a number of questions coming in, as well as some more compliments, and a couple, more than one person said, "Oh my goodness, I have so much. I'm going to get back to the paper I was writing, or the project," and at least 2 people have already written saying, "I've got to go, and this is going to change my practice with my clients," which is absolutely awesome. But here's an interesting question from a philosopher. Suppose we assume that the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals are also most often the ones who are petitioning strongly for passing instruction, right? So they're asking, how do I pass? You can imagine, you know, people getting very frustrated with their lives. They go, you know, or a kid or teenager saying, how do I make friends? How do, you know, and help me be like the other kids? If that were the situation, if that's true, how should service providers or clinicians or parents think self-critically about how to respond, whether they should satisfy that request or deny the request?
A very interesting question, and I think a lot of it, you know, goes. I'm trying to think of the right way to frame this. Going back to the conversation around acquired disability, and, you know, to the extent to which these principles apply, I once read a very interesting analysis of this exact question in discussing the ethics of cosmetic surgery with regards to facial deformation, and there was a lot of back and forth in very similar ways regarding it. And I don't think it's exactly the same thing, in part because I do think, you know, the fact that these are natural traits present from birth that are often very much a part of someone's self-identity, and that are, you know, embedded neurologically in certain ways, you know, is relevant. But I think there are certain, you know, there are certain principles you can extrapolate. So, you know, what I would say here is I think you need to have a very in-depth counseling process. You know, if someone comes to you and says, you know, everybody, you know, treats me badly because I don't make eye contact with them, you know, and I don't have any friends because I don't make eye contact, I don't know that the most ethical response you can give to that person is, great, let's teach you how to make eye contact, then you'll have friends, you know, then people won't treat you badly. I don't know that that is the most appropriate response. You know, now if someone is saying in a very, you know, targeted way, you know, I am struggling in this workplace, you know, because I'm being treated badly, and I know it's wrong for them to treat me badly that way. You know, but if I, you know, sort of act more confidently and, you know, talk with a more typical prosody while I'm at work, you know, I know that'll cost me something. I know I shouldn't have to do that. I know that's not right, but I'm gonna, you know, make the decision to do it contextually, you know, from the hours of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. because I really, you know, need to get ahead in this job for the next few years, you know, before I can take the next step in my career. That might be more appropriate. The key, though, is, and here we bring it back to outcome measurement, you can't make that kind of individualized decision in a standardized clinical outcome measure. You know, so we are talking about revising the measures that are really designed to define progress across the board, you know, for everyone. And so there are fascinating, you know, back and forth discussions regarding what individual providers should do in individual cases. And I think it's worth exploring and interrogating that. And I hope this lecture and some of the papers I intend to produce from it produce a really robust research literature on the topic. But I think the first step needs to be getting these things out of these outcome measures, which are used as the default for defining intervention success.
All right, that's really important. We've had some other questions, a couple other questions. So one particularly focused on quality of life measures, and eventually I'd like to, I'm going to maybe offline ask you about the role of impairments, but I don't want you to respond, but I think right now, because there's a couple other things that I think we should get to first, that it will have broader interest. But there are a couple of questions about this, about sort of advocacy or alliance, really, in some ways. One person asked, how can others, I guess, NTs, right, neurotypical people, support this effort that you're talking about, and the changes that you are trying to make or advocate for. And I'm going to ask you another question at the same time, and you don't have to answer them in the same order. If you want to answer one and then ask me to repeat the other one, that's fine too. There's one person who asks, well, wait, if I start thinking about neurodiversity and apply it to another type of disability, another sort of neurological disability, is that unfair? Am I appropriating? Would that be inappropriate? Is that be misappropriation if I take this idea from the autism community and apply it somewhere else?
I certainly don't think it's misappropriation. I encourage you to do so. I tend to think of it as exporting the revolution. So by all means, in fact, there's been some very interesting research recently on applying very interesting writing, I should say, on applying the neurodiversity framework to stuttering. That I've been quite excited about. And there's long-standing discussions around neurodiversity in the context of dyslexia, ADHD, various forms of mental illness. Sort of an interesting discussion in the mental illness conversation, because historically, one of the frames of the mental health consumer community is the idea of recovery as a positive good. Mental health consumers have generally framed recovery as something that they want, as equivalent to no longer being subject to coercion and being able to live in the community and so on. So in some ways that conflicts with the neurodiversity framework, at the very least semantically, in that, we would very much refer to ourselves as still autistic, even, when we're quite happy and doing well. I once had an interesting conversation with Will Hall, who's part of the psych survivor mental health consumer community, and very much part of that vision of recovery and mental illness, where he asked me, now, do you think autism is a real thing? I said, what do you mean? Do I think it's a real thing? I run an organization, it's been relevant in my life in all kinds of ways. Yes, I think it's neurological. We've got, MRIs. I can, look at the studies. So I think you do sometimes, the one risk that I sometimes do see in applying the neurodiversity frame beyond autism is there are some communities where the self-advocates there very much don't want that. They've bought into a very different conception. Mental health consumer, psych survivor world, some elements of it are still challenging the neurological basis for mental illness. The neurodiversity movement very much accepts and affirms the neurological basis of autism. So I think you, do see a little tension there. But in general, we want to see folks accept the neurodiversity frame. We welcome it, and I encourage folks to bring it into any context in which they feel it's relevant. Another question was about allies. Well, first, I encourage you to check out ASAN's website, www.autisticadvocacy.org, and lots of opportunities to get involved, either via donating or signing up for our email list and so on. I also think there are unique opportunities that you may have as professionals. Many of you are service providers, and I think you can work to use the role that you have, and sometimes the privilege that you have within your field as someone who's on the acceptable side of the provider consumer line to encourage reform. Somebody asked earlier, is there any way to reform ABA? And I would find it really, I probably would be a lot more optimistic about the answer to that question if a lot of the people asking it were applying their efforts to reforming ABA rather than asking if there was a way to do so. Because to date, I haven't really seen, very much in that space. I've seen much more around defending an ABA that could exist rather than the ABA that does exist. And I'm, understandably skeptical about the process of change, given where that investment has taken place. But even if you're in another field, there are lots of ways that neurodiversity principles could be relevant to clinical psychology, to occupational therapy, to speech pathology, to lots of fields that autistic people or people with other neurological disabilities interact with. So, leverage whatever standing you have to advance these ideas and work with autistic people in partnership to do so. One of the really exciting things is we're seeing a growing generation of autistic researchers. And so I think there are a lot of folks to partner with towards those ends.
Fantastic. I would say, I would add, if I may, there are ways of talking that are, and referring to diversity and autistic people and autistic traits that are more and less respectful, and we sometimes can learn how to express ourselves in a way that's more respectful when we don't know otherwise. Here's a question, and of course we're going on. Most people have had to go, and I don't. Nobody should feel guilty about fading away by their attention or needing to go. There's an interesting question from someone who has a lot of experience working with autistic people in the community, and this person asks, well, there may be a lot of autistic people who've learned to suppress, right, their autistic behavior to cover or pass, and for practical reasons, right, at work or whatnot. And how can we support those people, who've already learned to do that and learned that this is where they have to, or feel like they have to live their lives?
I think a lot of the value of autistic community is really to create spaces where people, can let go of that to some extent. At the various autistic community conferences and social gatherings, there's often a tremendous feeling of relief on the part of people of letting go of a burden that they carry with them every day in their day-to-day lives, by virtue of entering a space without, the oppressive passing demand that can be so pervasive. So, I think it's very tricky because, of course, people do learn to pass, and often they have, reason to do so, thinking about the professional or personal consequences, of what will happen to them if they don't. And I don't know that we should be second guessing their judgment. But the more that we can, try and connect autistic people with other autistic people so that there are spaces where we don't feel that demand, and B, try and change our workplaces, try and change our schools and so on to make those passing demands go away or become less severe. I think the better off we'll be, and the more accommodating and inclusive our communities will be.
All right, that's fantastic. One of the key organizers of Artscape was here, had to leave a few minutes ago, but she helps to provide one of those spaces where autistic people can go and drop the mask, and it's interesting to hear from people how comfortable they are there, and how that's a place where they have learned to accept themselves and more.
Okay, we should probably wrap up at the hour. So let's
So
but I'm hoping you can save the chat transcript and send it over to me.
Yes, I will. I will highlight it. I lost the last one, so I'm going to, before I close out, I'm going to copy it over into a Word document. Good. I'm not sure that I have questions left. I may have, on new topics that haven't been pretty well covered. I may have, my joint attention is not entirely functional, so going back and forth between the talk and the chat. Good. Here is one from. I think you've actually answered this at the end of your talk, but it was sent earlier by Cecilia, who says hi, and is asking about what meaningful health outcomes for autistic individuals would be and which you would prioritize. I think you were kind of punted that to the empirical work. Well, let's see what autistic people care about. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely a lot of there's a lot of empirical work that needs to be done in that space, and I think that certainly very relevant as an area for future work. I would also say that I think often we undervalue the process of looking at outcomes that are relevant to the general public as well, which is to say that there's remarkably little work looking at, for example, the effect of various modes of service provision in autism on educational inclusion or academic achievement. It sometimes seems that we are so obsessed with getting people to imitate typical appearance that we forget that the purpose of school is for children to learn something as well. And then similarly, when we talk about health outcomes, we often don't give enough emphasis to some of the same outcomes regarding chronic conditions, co-occurring mental health issues, and wellness that regarding physical health that exists in the general population. And there are obviously unique ways that those things need to be pursued for autistic people. But I think, we're going to simultaneously need to see a process of revising a lot of these autism-specific outcome measures. And we're going to need to remind the field that, autistic people, still are going to need the same kinds of primary care and you know, educational and academic achievement outcomes that we care about with the non-disabled population. So.
Right, right. Which reminds me of some of the ways that your personal story is told by Steve Silverman about, you know, sort of looking around saying, wait a second, you know, what happened to the school part? You know, I'm here to learn, and you know, people can look at how that's told in NeuroTribes. It took me a couple tries to understand a question that's come back from one of the philosophers who's here, who's interested in exploring this idea of, well, that goes something like this: if autistic people are capable of passing and then they choose not to, right? If we make this into an optional thing, then we have an interesting situation where somebody who chooses not to might be seen as uncooperative, right? And therefore sort of causing trouble, right? And sort of like the person who could walk but decides, oh, well, I'm gonna be, you know, I'm gonna say I have a mobility impairment. And so I wonder if that sort of touches anything for you, this
absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad you raised that, because it connects back to the very first thing I talked about, which is the concept of covering, which I for the purposes of simplicity, rolled into the word passing, but they're actually very different things. You know, Kenji Yoshino's book, I believe it's called Covering: The Hidden Assault on Our Civil Rights. I really could not recommend it enough. You know, really goes into this, that there is an expectation that immutable characteristics are considered legitimate, and you know, you aren't allowed to discriminate against someone based on immutable characteristics, but characteristics that can be changed, there is a strong expectation in our society that you're supposed to align them with typical appearance, with normalcy. And that's really something we should challenge: the covering demand, the expectation that you can be autistic, but you can't look autistic, you know, or any number of other variants on it, is a tremendously harmful one, and gets at the core of what the neurodiversity movement is trying to address. So I see that really as an area in which the neurodiversity critique has the opportunity to make common cause with many other parts of not just the disability rights movement and the disability community, but with other aspects of marginalized identity, and pushing back against those forms of covering demands. We have to challenge the idea that you have to be as normal as it is possible for you to be.
Fantastic. That is a wonderful summary of your position and your presentation right there, which I love. It's fantastic to end on that note. Thank you
very much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for having me. I hope this is interesting food for thought. Have a good one, everyone.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Amazing.